Let's begin the first session. I am Baksu Kim, Honorary Research Fellow of Kiev. It's my very great pleasure to chair the first session of this wonderful international conference. Subject of this session is regional integration in Europe and Asia, current status and future prospect. For this session, we invited 3 speakers and 2 discussants. Before opening the session, I'd like to introduce briefly our speakers with the topic of the presentation and discussant. The first speaker is Mr. Raoul de Luxembourg, the DG ECOFIN, European Commission. He will present a paper on European integration, achievement to date, and challenges ahead. Second speaker is Professor Teofilo Daquila, National University of Singapore. He will present a paper titled Asian Regional Integration, Challenges and Opportunities. And the third speaker is Professor Sung-Hoon Park, Dean of GSIS, Korea University. He presented a paper on regional integration in East Asia, roadmap and procedures. On these 3 presentations, we invite 2 discussants. They will comment and ask questions. First discussant is Professor Jae-sung Lee of Korea University. And the second discussant is Mr. Jung-ho Nam of Jung Daily newspaper. It would be very nice to applaud our speakers and discussants. We are now behind of the schedule, 30 minutes of behind schedule. So time allocation is one of the most serious job of the chairperson. I want each speaker to have about 20 minutes of presentation and each discussant about 10 minutes for discuss and comment. After 3 presentations, 2 discussants will discuss 4 or 3 presentations. For time controls before 5 minutes of finishes, I'd like to tap these battles. Yeah, long distance. So, but I expect discussant not to run out of time. After the presentation of speakers and discussion of commentators, floor will open if we have time. It's time for first presentations. Mr. Luxembourg, please.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me now. Thank you. First of all, I would like to thank very much the Korea University, the Korean Institute for Economic Policy, and the Free University of Brussels for inviting me here to deliver this speech. A lot has been said already on the European integration. You have heard the first speeches that have given a very wide presentation of the issues. But I would like to start from the basics. This is the European Union, and the first achievement that is to be recorded is to have integrated 27 countries and a number of candidate countries into a process of regional integration, and a successful process of regional integration. The European Union is one of the richest regions in the world. It's the largest economy in the world, and in terms of per capita income, one of the richest. And it is a great trade power. Our share of world trade goods in goods is 17%. It's higher than the one of the United States. In services, we are even stronger. I think it's important to remember this when we start the discussion, because we hear a lot about the current problems in the European Union. I think it's always important to remember where we stand and what we have achieved. In terms of achievements, the list of the importance is personal, of course. And this has come recently, so it's also very fashionable to speak about the achievements of the European Union as a peace builder in the world. But I think it's worth reflecting carefully on this. The European Union has been so successful in building peace that has transformed a continent that was known to be, if not at the center of all the wars, at the center of most wars in the world, into an area of peace and stability. This is not a small achievement, and it's an achievement that has been built carefully over 50 years of integration. But it was very much present at the beginning. The Nobel Peace Prize has been granted to the European Union this year. And in the motivation, you see that the Union and its forerunners have, for over 6 decades, contributed to the advancement of peace and reconciliation, democracy and human rights in Europe. This is an element of great importance and explains also what is the reason of this success. The success was built on a vision, the vision of the founding fathers of the European Union. The vision was we should never repeat the mistakes of the Second World War in Europe. And the idea that came with it was that Europe should build up institutions that will link the nations into the defense of shared and common values and into the pursuit of their interest and their economic interest. So on one side it was visionary. Europe was coming out of a bitter war, was extremely divided, but the vision was let's build up institutions that will keep us together and will allow us not to repeat what the mistakes made in the past. And the second part was pragmatically, we need to build this on the economic interest and the improvement of the life of everyone. And so when we go to the achievements, I think that starting from peace and stability is the best way. The EU has been extremely attractive to other non-members and has been very successful in healing divisions that came from war, whether this is the Cold War, whether this is the Second World War, sometimes even earlier conflicts. And this has been done by integrating countries and attracting countries towards integration and integrating them into a bloc and a system that is based in this, on one side, institutional setup, and on the other side, on the economic aspects. However, there is a part in peace research, the institutional part is very much seen as prominent. The US created a parliament. The US created institutions that force national governments to dialogue constantly on every single aspect of the life. The US created an image, institutional image, and a government which is the European Commission. But the EU has done much more in order to achieve peace and stability. And there is a human side which is of enormous importance to the stability. The possibility for every citizen of the European Union to settle, work, and prosper wherever inside the European Union, from the point of Finland down to the bottom of Italy or Spain, having the same rights, the same freedoms, having institutions that are broadly similar, and a democratic representation that is, again, broadly similar and belongs to families in the European Parliament that share common type of values. So the human side of the integration is of enormous importance, and the Schengen Agreement has given a further step forward on the human side because it has allowed the European Union to physically eliminate the barriers inside the Union and to allow citizens to travel freely, but also to allow the border regions to connect to the border region of the other country into a network that is now similar to a unified country. The other key element is the creation of the single market. The single market means that the EU citizens and the EU entrepreneurs have freedom to choose. They can build up their business, send their goods everywhere in the Union. And for our trading partners, it means that they can send the goods everywhere inside the European Union, dealing with only one type of clearance. This is true for goods, this is true for services, this is true for capital. So a company can be established everywhere inside the European Union with broadly the same type of regulations and broadly the same type of security, and of course for people, as I mentioned earlier. And goods and people are free to move. And I've already mentioned the Schengen Agreement and the effect of the Schengen Agreement. But free to move is also the creation of an integrated network of roads, railways, and sea lines that connect Europe and integrate Europe. We have not only built all these connections and regulated all these connections, because it's very easy for a country to, for example, to tax excessively transfer on the roads, creating problems for the internal market. If the market has to be functioning, goods need to be traveled, and the conditions must be acceptable and facilitate to the utmost. But not only we have built this inside the EU, we will also build outside the EU connections to the rest of the world. I don't have the picture, but all these lines extend outside the EU to connect us to the world. And although very much debatable now, I think the euro is a great achievement of the European integration. And it's an essential part of completing the internal market. I worked at the Italian Treasury when we were discussing the creation of the euro. And I remember I was young, and I remember asking the question, but why do we need a single currency? We're not necessarily an optimal currency area. There is a lot of debate. The answer was very simple. We have built up a market, a single market. We have created the structure. We have allowed freedom of movement. We have harmonized taxation. We can't allow one country to tax all the other countries by simply devaluating the exchange rate. So the euro is not only a very useful tool for the European Union, it's an essential part of the internal market. Without it, other more complex arrangements have to be put in place. And the countries that do not belong to the euro have exchange rate bans to the euro or are linked to the euro in various ways, precisely because it's difficult. It's not possible to allow them to beggar thy neighbor and evaluate without control. Now, with the euro, we were thinking, and I'm just going back a few years, that Europe was smoothly going ahead in the world, achieving, creating a substantial level of regional integration. We had one element of criticism that was present and very strong already on the lack of democratic support for the EU policy, or if you like, the distance between the EU institutions and the citizens. There was, back in 2008, a big debate on this. The answer was seen very much in the building of or connecting the EU institutions with the national institutions that were felt as more democratically representative and could allow the EU institutions to receive, by using more of the national institutions to receive a greater legitimacy for what they were doing. Then, in 2008, the problem struck. The EU realized that we had been a little bit too complacent, and that it's not, the creation of the euro was not as simple as we had thought, and the global economic crisis exposed the limit of what we had done. But after the economic crisis, and I think that the euro, in the first 2 years of the economic crisis, had actually sheltered Europe from a lot of the problems that might have come out. We see euro as being part of the problem, but in fact, we don't imagine, or it's difficult to do the counterfactual, but imagine what would have happened inside the European Union with a number of different currencies. But then, as part of the reply of Europe to the economic crisis, some of the countries expanded the fiscal policy or had to bail out the banks, and this created what we call the vicious circle between sovereign debt, financial stability, and economic growth. The problem was, put very simple, that we had a single currency and a single market, but not a single state on the back of it. When we speak to the Americans look at the European Union in our dialogues and tell us the answer is simple. You need a federal reserve system and you need a federal government. Of course, the answer is not so simple for Europe because we are not a federal state. Nonetheless, I think that, and this is the key part of my message, Europe has taken very serious steps, and the Europe that exists now is not the Europe that existed 3 years ago in terms of integration. Indeed, the issue for us is to improve governance, this has already been mentioned, ensure economic growth, competitiveness, and ensure the financial stability and viability. In terms of governance, and I think that the issue is not as simple as creating a federal state. The issue for the EU is to integrate countries and national countries and EU mechanism into something that is viable as a state. And we've done that by creating a number of rules and by entering agreements that national governments have undertaken willingly and that will ensure that the policy of all the states that are member of the euro, the fiscal policy, is well coordinated and that no country could, in the future, come back to the same situation where some countries have expended too much and this has created risk. The sovereign debt hits banks that own the debt and create financial instability. We have realized that for the euro to be a viable currency, it's necessary to have, first of all, a financial structure and a banking system that is unified and responds to common rules, and to have a number of security systems, like the possibility of recapitalized banks or to ensure a viable bankruptcy system for banks, that has to be common. And at the same time, we made progress in structural reforms. This has happened more at the level of member states than at the level of the EU, but the EU is supporting this through coordinated action. What is left out of this very holistic approach at the moment, and is still under consideration, is to move from what we call the economic and monetary union that we are committed to, to promote and to improve and to fully implement in the coming years, to a fiscal union that is not simply a coordination of all the national fiscal policies, but it's also a sovereign, the sovereign fiscal union. Now, I will skip all this long presentation, otherwise the chairman will and go just to the end. The point is, and this is where I would like to end my presentation with the words of President Barroso. The point is that Europe is a new project in mankind history. It's not a nation, it's not an empire, but it's a group of free-willing nations that have decided that by pooling their sovereignty together and acting together, they would be more effective in defending their interests and promoting their values. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for presentation of Dr. Luxemburg. I'm sorry we have no enough time for your presentation. Because of time, I cannot summarize his presentation, so we continue the second presentation. Dr. Dakila, please.
Thank you very much, Professor Kim. First of all, I would like to extend my warmest thanks and to the organizers for kindly inviting me to this conference. Professor Park, Dr. Kim, Professor Paul Knop, and from the KIEP, Dr. Wook Chae. I'm glad to be back to Korea University. This is my 5th time. I was here before as a visiting professor at the Graduate School of International Studies, which was funded by the AUN, the ASEAN University Network, and CASIAS, which is an association of Southeast Asian Studies of Korea. And then I was also here for 3 times as part of the International Summer Campus. And I agree with with Ambassador Ho Yang-an regarding the image of this university in providing a warm reception or hospitality, not only to its own students, but even to visitors, and that's why I'm very keen to be back. One of the research interests that I do is the ASEAN economic regionalism, particularly the intra-ASEAN, as well as ASEAN's relations with the European Union. And I have written a few papers that deal with this issue, Asia-Europe relations, and a subset of this is the Korea-Singapore economic relations, which I have published in one of the proceedings, which, as I've said, funded by the Joint Research Fellowship. Now, let me move on to my main talk, given the time constraint. I'll talk about the ASEAN regional integration, Asian regional integration. And however, as I've said, my main, okay, thank you. My main area of interest is ASEAN. However, some of the findings for ASEAN, of course, apply as well to the whole of Asia. These are the key questions. There are mainly two questions. To what extent has Asia integrated? And the second question is the main topic or the main theme of this paper, which is in terms of the challenges and opportunities of Asian integration. Now, the first question, I have relied on the results of a study conducted by the Asian Development Bank. This is one of the regional institutions which has been very useful in terms of funding the development-oriented type of activities as well as coming up with their own research. And so I have availed of their findings. And they look at the extent of Asian integration using a set of indicators which I have identified after reading the whole report. And Asia here refers to the 48 member countries grouped into 6 subregions: Central Asia, East Asia, Southeast Asia, South Asia, the Pacific, and Oceania. And the integration indicators are the number of RTAs, regional trade agreements, the share of intra-regional flows in trade, intra-regional flow in foreign direct investment, in capital markets, particularly the intra-regional flows in, or intra-regional shares rather, in equities and bond holdings, intra-regional shares of tourism, output correlation, and migration to population ratio. So the ADB has this particular set of data, basic data that they gathered from the different countries. However, some of these indicators are not complete given the fact that some of the different submissions were not done by some of the member countries, the 48 member countries. Now, moving on to the first indicator, the number of RTAs involving at least one Asian country has dramatically increased over the past decade, reaching a total of 190 regional trade agreements as of January 2012. 126 were concluded and 64 were under negotiation. Now, 115 of these RTAs are with countries outside Asia, and this reflects the strong extra-Asian trade relations. And this is also true in the case of ASEAN, where most of the trade and investment relations are, of course, outside ASEAN. Of the 75 RTAs forged with countries inside Asia, 42 were outside own subregion, and 33 were inside own subregion. I have provided some statistics which were not included in the proceedings because of, I submitted it a bit late, but I can certainly pass it on to you through email if you are interested in these RTAs and other statistics. The second is in terms of the extent of Asian economic integration. It's strongly observed in trade, in tourism, and capital markets, but much less in foreign direct investment because after the 1997 crisis, the levels of foreign direct investment in ASEAN is not the same as before the 1997 crisis. There's also a higher degree of economic interdependence in regional production, and this was based on the output correlation coefficients. There is this diagram which can be, which is also downloaded from the same study, in which there are differences in the numbers which reflect the differences in the extent or the magnitude of integration. All right, so one of the highlights of this report, of this diagram, is the green line there represents the pre-1997 level of foreign direct investment, which is outside, right, and higher than the post-1997 crisis. Asian integration is market-driven because of the expanding scope of Asian markets and because also of the policy of the different countries in Asia to move away from either centrally planned economy or towards a market-based economy, particularly in the areas of trade and finance. It is multi-speed because of the rise of various functional programs, as in trade, money, finance, and infrastructure. And it is multi-track because of the sub-regional institutions and intra-regional forums. And we have specific examples like ASEAN, ASEAN Plus 3, East Asia Summit, APEC, ASEF, GMS, the Greater Mekong Sub-Region, the South Asia Association of Regional Cooperation, SASEC, and CAREC. And because of the establishment of mechanisms for macroeconomic and financial cooperation, especially in the light of the 97-98 crisis and in the future crisis, in order to prevent the recurrence of any type of crisis, particularly financial crisis, making funds available to those countries which are in need of emergency money. The The fourth finding is the overall level of Asian economic integration remains uneven across sub-regions and sector, and this is a well-known fact given the disparity, economic disparity, or the huge income gap among the different Asian countries. East Asia was observed to be the most integrated sub-region, with all indicators improving except intra-regional trade. Southeast Asia recorded an improvement in all indicators except intra-regional FDI and portfolio holdings. South Asia registered a decrease in integration except for intra-regional FDI. Again, I have relevant statistics to substantiate that particular finding in terms of the production network and trade, capital markets, macroeconomic links, and transmigration, which of course is an interesting phenomenon that is taking place not only in Asia and the Pacific, but in the entire world. Finally, the benefits of increasing level of economic integration in Asia has been unevenly distributed, and in terms of infrastructure, access to safe drinking water, infant mortality, and so on and so forth. And this is expected because in any form of development, there are always people or countries or nations who are left behind. And of course, this is the challenge for many governments, how to address this widening gap between and among the different countries, and also between and among the different peoples, even within the specific countries. Now the challenges, in first one I identified is economic diversification, which is simply defined as the moving away from agriculture activities towards industry, particularly manufacturing and services. Different countries in Southeast Asia are at different stages of development. There are some which are still very much heavily dependent on agriculture. There are some which are dependent on manufacturing, particularly the East Asia, and some older members of ASEAN like Singapore, Malaysia, Thailand, Indonesia, and the Philippines. And the lesson for this is whether, for example, within the context of ASEAN, whether the CLMV countries, Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, and Vietnam, do they take the lessons of the older countries in ASEAN, that is to promote industrialization as a way, as a means to grow and develop. And it has been the case, unlike the strategy which has been, unlike in the case of Japan and Korea and other NIEs, in which they have relied on their own domestic savings, rather than in the Southeast Asian model, in which they relied on foreign direct investment. So this is one of the differences, how Southeast Asia and Northeast Asia, and perhaps the Asia in general, have grown and developed, and that is whether to rely heavily on domestic savings, as I've said, the case of Japan and Korea, or whether to welcome foreign capital. And welcoming foreign capital is part of these regional integration agreements. These are some of the problems: the volatility of agricultural prices, the discovery of product substitutes, The rising FDI on industries and services is not really a problem, but it is a contributory factor to the transformation towards industry, manufacturing particularly, and the rising incomes per capita. So what if people's incomes per capita increase? So it means that the demand for goods and services will change, the tastes and preferences will change, and that's why those countries which are heavily dependent on services, they of course benefit. And among the countries in Southeast Asia or in Asia, Hong Kong, Singapore are very much dependent on services. Singapore particularly, 60 to 70% of its own output or GDP is in services. The negative side of this is when there is a crisis like the 97-98 crisis, services was the worst hit, banking and finance was the worst hit, and then in 2001, when there was the World Trade Center bombing, Singapore was hit because of reliance on tourism. The second point is investment and service liberalization, and this is again in terms of the changes in policies in order to welcome foreign capital. Different countries in Asia behave differently. Some welcome foreign capital, others are not. So of course, the rules on investment have to be improved upon or have to be harmonized in order to bring out a much higher degree of integration. Shift towards knowledge-based economy, the heavy dependence on information and communications technology. Some people will be left behind, other countries are also left behind. So again, this is a challenge for many governments. How do you narrow the gap, which is what we call the digital gap or digital divide? And then structural unemployment, right? There will be a mismatch of jobs available. Those without the relevant skills, they need to upgrade. But different countries have different amount of resources to be invested in relevant skills training or upgrading. Changes in educational curricula is also very important. And in order to be competitive, even universities have to be competitive as well. And so in line with the global needs, right, some universities have done a lot to internationalize their universities, internationalizing at home, internationalizing overseas. For example, in Singapore, the 50% of the university cohort, for example, are sent overseas, and there is an intention to increase this to 70%, so that many students will have the chance to go overseas, because it is important that the attributes of graduates are addressed. What kind of graduates do we want to produce? We want to produce cross-culturally aware students, global citizens, graduates who can deal with interpersonal relationships, and also in terms of analytical thinking and creative thinking. So those are the kind of graduate attributes that we want to produce. We listen to feedback from employers. What kind of graduates do you want? External disturbances. We have so many of this, and again, the challenge is not to repeat, or I mean, how do we address if these disturbances recur? Examples, I will not go through all of them. I would like to highlight the oil shock, of course, how to respond to the oil shocks. The 97-98 crisis is worthy of mention because it is the collapse of the total economy. It's a total economy collapse, right? From the production sector, the services sector, the external sector, the financial sector. So in the Asian region, it is Thailand and Indonesia which were the worst hit. And then, of course, Korea was hit as well. Malaysia, the Philippines was less hit, Singapore was less hit. How do these countries respond? They respond differently. Some went to the IMF. Others, like Malaysia, did not make use of the IMF loans, but instead increased economic activity in Malaysia by domestic refinancing. I have, at the other side, we have the US crisis and the EU crisis, and these have certainly affected the Asian economies.
Dr. Killa, please 5 minutes.
5 minutes, okay. So the next one is the rise of Asian economies. We are booming in Asia despite the slowdown in US and EU, right? And we have China and India, although they're slowing down, they are considered to be the drivers of growth in the Asian region. But in order to sustain growth, of course, there is a need for financing, right? And unlike the Great Depression, now we are in a world where policy has been coordinated. There's what we call the international policy coordinated, where the central banks of many governments have injected liquidity into the system. Now, there are opportunities like the huge consumer market in Asia, the rising incomes per capita. The challenge is how to sustain growth, and this is in line with Professor Kim's keynote speech in terms of sustainable growth, sustainable development, how to narrow income gap as well. Now, I'd like to highlight this table, which tells us that the intra-Europe trade is about 70.6%, whereas in the case of Asia, the intra-Asia trade is 52.8%, and in fact, intra-Asia trade has been rising, right? So we need to ensure that all economies are growing because it's a win-win situation as for exports and imports. Rising domestic savings, very high levels of savings for China, 52%. Brunei is 54%, Malaysia 40%, Singapore 52%, and so on and so forth. Now, from very low level of savings, these countries have increased their level of savings, and what is the implication of that? It's telling us that the resources are now available for these governments to be spent on more productive activities like education, which is a very important asset. And then in terms of the international reserves, we contribute about 6.7 trillion, the whole of Asia, and that's a lot of money. So what do you do with 6.7 trillion worth of foreign exchange reserves, right? And East Asia has been lending a hand, of course, to other countries in terms of purchasing government bonds. The improvement of society's well-being. The question here is, so what if people are living longer, if they are healthy? What are the implications of this? It implies us that government resources have to be spent more on the aging population. There must be changes in the retirement age and so on and so forth. And finally, the rising trend towards regionalism. This was talked about earlier by in terms of the WTOs, the formation of RTAs, some statistics. The competitiveness issue, as I've said, how do we promote or improve competitiveness? What is the role of government? What is the role of university? What is the role of the companies? What is the role of individuals? Right? And as I always tell my students, how can you become competitive? So in terms of learning languages, in terms of learning softwares and hardwares and so on and so forth. How has Asia integrated? There are many ways. ASEAN, SAARC, APEC, AFTA, ASEM. So this is just like, how do you respond to the increasing regionalism? You have to increase your intra-regional activities as well. Some statistics on FTAs. We have a lot of FTAs, as I mentioned earlier, right? Singapore has the highest number of FTAs, having started it all, having been criticized by some countries in ASEAN, only that these countries have also followed what Singapore has done. And so this is what has been happening. Now, towards an ASEAN economic community, which is in the context of the European model, the free movement of goods, the free movement of services, production factors, including labor, but labor means everyone will be moving around. But to start with, the movement will be in terms of the professional groups, and how do you implement mobility of professional groups? One way is to harmonize the educational standards, qualifications, and skills, and that is through the mutual recognition agreements. And to date, there are 7 specific professions which are recognized that could start off this ball rolling as far as mobility of labor in ASEAN is concerned, and this could be replicated in the whole of Asia Pacific or Asia. We have engineering, nursing, architecture, surveys, accountancy, medical practitioners, and dental practitioners. So this is a challenge. How do you come up with harmonized educational standards, qualifications, and skills? How do you implement this? And then finally, in terms of alternatives or a wider Asian community, this was launched during the recent ASEAN summit held in Cambodia, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. This is the ASEAN +6, and here, according to Dr. Surin, it's a big achievement. According to New Zealand Prime Minister, it's a bold move to deepen integration in the most dynamic region. The goal is further the deepening, right? ASEAN has enlarged, so enlargement plus deepening activities, and this is for the whole of Asia. Okay, I think that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Gilla, for your very interesting and informative presentation. We'll invite the third speaker, Dr. Park, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Title of my talk is East Asian Economic Integration, Roadmap and Procedure. So I like to be brief because the chairman has instructed me to shorten my presentation. So my storyline is as follows. There are problems emerging from the East Asian regional integration, and I'd like to sketch these problems. Especially, I'd like to note that a very important problem here is the vacuum of leadership problem, vacuum of leadership. So after describing and analyzing the leadership problem, I'd like to go over to present what's the most important step towards East Asian integration. And I found here that the Northeast Asian region should be first integrated. And to do that, what is the pre-step? The pre-step is Korea-China FTA. So the storyline goes as follows. As you all know, East Asia is a latecomer in regionalism. We East Asian economies were quite immune to the increasing regionalist tendency worldwide. We have got the increasing regionalist tendency in the world economy since the beginning of 1990s. But the East Asian countries were quite silent in the making of regionalism until the end of 1990s. So from the 1940s to 1990s, Asian countries were relying more on multilateralism, relying and benefiting from the liberalization and opening taking place on the GATT and WTO. But my analysis is that the Asian financial crisis has triggered Asian countries to pay more attention to their regionalism, their own regionalism. But the problem here is that the Asian countries started the regionalism, but they started not FTAs among themselves, but the start was with the countries in the other continents. So we call this transcontinental regionalism, such as Japan starts FTA with Mexico, and Korea starts or negotiates FTA with Chile, and Singapore does it with other countries in other regions except ASEAN. So that why is it that probably we have a number of impediments here, not only political but also cultural, as well as we have had many history related problems, so that the East Asian countries were quite dynamic in making their own regionalism, but beginning was not intra-regional, but trans-regional, we can say. But if you take a look at the trends in East Asia, especially since mid-2000s, Asian countries have returned to intra-regionalism. I mean, we have got increasing number of intra-regional FTAs, including Japan, Singapore, including Korea, ASEAN, Japan, China networks, so that there are these causes problems. Problem here is that we have only discussion about region-wide FTA, but we have not seriously started the negotiation. The recent announcement that the ASEAN plus 3 plus 3 countries, so the 16 countries in the framework of East Asia Summit have agreed upon to launch the negotiation on RCEP, as Professor Kim Se-won mentioned in his keynote speech. RCEP, Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, is in the making. But we don't know yet whether it will be successfully concluded within 2-3 years, how many problems will arise here, and so on, whether it will be really a region-wide FTA. Some countries could fall out. We are very unsure and uncertain about the future of this regionalism in East Asia, so that the problems are, number of problems emerging here in East Asian regionalism is, in my view, number one, the leadership rivalry. Leadership rivalry, especially between Japan and China. Japan and China leadership rivalry is creating kind of a vacuum in leadership. Number two is overlapping membership. And overlapping membership means many countries, individual countries in East Asia, attempt to become hub of FTA. Japan does it, Korea does it, and Singapore, as my friend Teofilo mentioned, has the highest number of FTAs among the Asian countries. The similar phenomenon is observed in Latin America as well. Chile, for instance, right? Chile has more than 20 FTAs, and more than 70% of the country's trade is done within FTA, and so on. So this is a real problem, that the East Asian regionalism is characterized by overlapping membership without any region-wide FTA like NAFTA or EU or things like that. Therefore, because of this overlapping membership, we have not clearly identified or clearly defined territory for East Asian regionalism, and the vision is not clear, and we have a number of impediments and obstacles to overcome. Especially, I like to note that the leadership issue is a real problem here. Leadership rivalry between China and Japan, as I noted earlier quite briefly, is causing a number of problems, especially creating leadership vacuum. And we have had a temporary vehicle of East Asian regionalism, which is so-called ASEAN centrality. But I don't know whether the ASEAN centrality was effective enough. to bring about, to promote East Asian regionalism. Southeast Asian scholar like Teofilo might think in different way, and I'm really contesting the value of ASEAN centrality in promoting Asian or East Asian regionalism, whether it has done proper job assigned to it. I mean, ASEAN centrality is a temporary vehicle, and if you look at or if you read articles of Japanese and Chinese scholars, they all accept that this is a role the ASEAN has to play to promote the East Asian regionalism. But in my assessment, ASEAN was not very successful in meeting this requirement and expectation. So that in this view, I mean, in this line, I'd like to propose that we have to have a kind of leadership competition. If the Japanese-Chinese leadership rivalry creates a vacuum and ASEAN is not effective enough, then what to do? And here comes the role of Korea. And the Korean government and Korean officials have tried to play the role of intermediator or mediator in the East Asian regionalism, so that I mean this is to make Korea to play a competition to the ASEAN centrality. Then we will have two leadership competition in the region. One competition between Japan and China, and the other between ASEAN and Korea. And if these competitions are constructive enough, then probably we have better conditions for sustainable economic integration in East Asia. The theory of mine is that Northeast Asia has to be first integrated. In my view, without Northeast Asian integration, better to say CJK integration, there is no real integration of East Asia. So that it is also to say that if ASEAN is not effective enough, then why shouldn't we try to have this leadership role to be played by three countries? I like to call this the key trilateral relations. CJK relations should be promoted, bettered, and so on and so forth. So how to bring about the Northeast Asian integration? And here, again, comes the role of Korea. I mean, Northeast Asia is essential, and then we have big problems to have China-Japan FTA. Then why shouldn't Korea approach China and Japan individually to have FTAs? Or why should Korea not persuade China and Japan to have trilateral FTAs? So very recently, the three countries, China, Japan, Korea, have announced that they will start the negotiation on CJK FTA in the beginning of next year, and that is good sign. But we have still problem meaning or still uncertainties about this CJK FTA, whether it will be really possible to have this FTA within short period of time, whether there is another way, alternative way to do it, because we have been negotiating Korea-China FTA for a while. We had negotiated Korea-Japan FTA in the early 2000s. The negotiation which is now halted because of a number of problems. But if we successfully negotiate Korea-China FTA, then this will be a very important building block towards Northeast Asian FTA. So that I wanted to propose stepwise approach. Korea-China FTA should be playing the role of building block here. So that step one should be successful conclusion of Korea-China FTA, and step two will be let Japan join the Korea-China FTA to complete this three-country FTA, or negotiate Korea-Japan FTA, and then merge the two to have quasi-trilateral FTA between China, Japan, Korea as a second and third step. And then when this Northeast Asian FTA is completed, then we can merge this Northeast Asian FTA with the Southeast Asian FTA, which is called ASEAN Free Trade Agreement, and then we will have completed the East Asian FTA. So there is the roadmap I like to propose, and the procedures towards this vision of East Asian regionalism. We have still some problems to solve, because another problem in the East Asian regionalism is that we have external stakeholders very strongly represented in the region, especially the role of United States. And also we have seen a number of other countries are having interest in participating in East Asian regionalism, like Australia, New Zealand, and then sometimes Russia also is quite interested in having closer relationship with East Asian countries. So how to deal with them? And here we have two approaches. One is the individual countries can do, I mean, as they do at the moment. For instance, Korea has already negotiated Korea-US FTA, and it is already in force. We have another Korea-EU FTA, and so on. Singapore has successfully negotiated FTA with the US, and so on and so forth. And Japan is approaching the TPP group to participate in the negotiation. So this is individual countries' track one. But track number two could be, if the East Asian regionalism is successful, then inter-regional regionalism could be set up by negotiating, for instance, with NAFTA, and by negotiating with the European Union, and then finally our final goal is achieved. That is multilateral trade liberalization. So that is my story, and I'd like to thank you for your attention. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Park. He showed interesting ideas for future road. Now we invite two discussants. First discussant is Professor Jason Lee of Korea University. 10 minutes are allowed for him.
Right. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And also thank you very much for three distinguished and insightful presentation. As a scholar working on this field, and as always student of learning from regional integration, both in Europe and in East Asia. Well, first I would like to make a couple of general comments and maybe the question regarding the presentation, but I will skip the detailed question on microscopic side, but rather I will go for the more broader and macro side. Okay, first, if I add one or just two more comments on the earlier presentation, then the first thing is the timing of this conference and the year, at this stage is once again it will be a good opportunity and very timely period to think about the European integration, because the European integration has always been a kind of role model for other region, but sometimes we learn not just from the good achievement and euphoria, but also we learn from the crisis and hardship and difficulties. So personally, I think East Asia and other regions can learn from Europe. Well, can learn from Europe in 2008 and after a lot more than Europe in 1992 when in the height, the euphoria of the Maastricht Treaty, or the 1999 the introduction of Euro. Well, certainly that can give a lot of the momentum and hope. But at the same time, the Europe in crisis is also a great lesson, because establishing a regional integration and regional community is one thing, but managing it and maintaining it will be even more challenging and actually even more important. So in that sense, the earlier presentation on the European the crisis in handling the financial issues and other economic issues will also shed a lot of light on the other parts of the world. And the European Union was my reading of European integration and European community is essentially it is a political community. We talk about the economic integration, but also EU is a political community. And sometimes people say, okay, the Europe went too far, and it actually raised it brought the sources of crisis. For example, the over-integration brought the financial crisis. But at the same time, the observation is, thanks to the integration, somehow, the political integration and political rationale behind the economic integration gave the enough resilience to this kind of economic and financial crisis. So maybe that kind of political element need a proper highlight. When we apply the European case to the East Asian case, then I think that the key thesis here is how to move from de facto integration. Here it means the level of economic interdependence, to de jure integration. That means the institutionalization. So, institutionalization will depend both on economic interdependence and secondly, the political momentum. And for that, Professor Park's emphasis on the leadership issues will be a very important point. So in East Asia, we see a lot of the huge gap actually between a number of initiatives. There are a number of initiatives and the actual level of implementation and achievement. So many initiatives, but loosely connected and relatively lower level of implementation. I think that is the current situation of East Asian economic integration. Professor Dakuela mentioned in one of the slides, East Asian integrations will be symbolized by market-driven, multi-speed, and multi-track. And if I rephrase it, I'm not downgrading East Asian side, but if I may rephrase it, it is fragmented, less coordinated, less coordinated integration process with weak or lukewarm political momentum. So, here was my actually, this is my question to maybe all the presenters. Yes, the East Asia, we know what we've been discussing for a while, and we know what need to be done. Professor Park suggested more integration in Northeast Asian side and constructive competition between Northeast Asia and Southeast Asia. I think that is also a very interesting and good point. But my slight concern and worry is we are still seeing a number of initiatives for further economic and trade integration in East Asia, like TPP is going on, APEC, SM+3, and a number of bilateral FTAs are going on. But how do you assess this kind of multi-track approach? It may increase the economic interdependence to some degree, but what do you think about the necessity of coordinating the trade, cooperation or integration procedure at the regional level or sub-regional level? Because the sub-regional and these multilateral trade institutions are fragmented sometimes by strong interest sharing with external stakeholder. So how the United States and how European Union will see will welcome a more highly integrated East Asia by themselves, and how we can more creatively and successfully coordinate first the internal trade integration, economic integration initiative together with the Asia and the other region, about the trade relation with Asia first together with other external stakeholders. That would be my big question to all of the presenters. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Lee. After the discussion of Dr. Nam, I'll give the speakers the response chance. Dr. Nam, please.
Okay, because of time limits, I just add just a few points and ask a question to each of you. And first of all, thank you for the presentation, and they are very insightful and very informative. And I know that this seminar is supposed to focus on economic integration, but I think political factors should not be underestimated. So, and I understand Mr. Luxembourg say that sovereign debt crisis should be the most important and serious problem for the European Union at the moment. But I think the European Union is facing another very fatal challenge, So it seems to me that nowadays European Union facing Euro-skepticism, especially in the United Kingdom. So according to a recent survey, I think it's more than 50%, I think something like 52% of the British public wants to say goodbye to the European Union. So I'd like to ask a question to Mr. Luxemburger. How seriously do you take the recent Europe skepticism in the United Kingdom? And do you think that there is a possibility that for the UK to leave the Union? This is my first question. And for Professor Dakilar, and you mentioned that the Asian integration had been carried out via the multi-track. I think this question is quite similar to Mr. Lee. But I think the European Union has taken a lead for the European integration for decades. So it seems to me that there is too many framework in ASEAN. So I would like to ask you whether you think that multi-track integration is desirable or not, and please tell me why you believe so. And finally, I like to ask a question to Professor Park. And you outlined a very interesting procedure to build a East Asian integration using the trilateral free trade agreement. But however, I think the relationship between the three major Northeastern Asian countries, Korea, China, and Japan, are very, very unstable because of many political reasons. So I think I don't need to mention the happening related to the territorial dispute. So I think that there is still a possibility for China to manipulate the free trade regime for the sake of political interest in the future. So I've seen how the Chinese government's behavior regarding the Senkaku Island dispute. Actually, they sent a vessel, to show how strong China is right now. So under this condition, do you still believe that the East Asian integration need to be completed using those seemingly unstable bilateral relationship between three countries? This is my final question. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nam. It's time for responses. I'll give you 2 minutes for each speaker. Dr. Luxembourg, please.
Thank you. Is it working? No. I think we need. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the questions. Thank you very much for the interesting presentations. Very briefly, of course, the European Union is a political construction. And that's why, I call it vision. You, Professor Park, call it leadership, but you need, in order to promote political integration, and regional integration, you need a political vision. And a political vision that is very clearly grounded in reality. The second aspect, indeed, the second part of the presentation was on the economic crisis. It's absolutely, it's very interesting to see how we react to crisis. Not only to this crisis, we reacted to a number of crises in the past. Now, this crisis is not about what we need to do. We know very well what we need to do. I think I've tried to pass a message that a lot of what we need to do we have done. The issue is to do it in a way that respects our structure and our political structure, that respects the need for a federal structure, which we see is absolutely necessary, and at the same time respects the national reality and the reality of nations in the EU. Euroscepticism, it is a political issue, but if you don't see the achievements of the EU of the 1990s and earlier, you don't understand why a lot of people in the EU is still willing to stick to the EU and pay a price for it. So it is true that, and it's not only by now, frankly, that the UK has a majority of people that, if asked in the street, will reply, yes, we want out. But it's also true that a lot of people in the UK, when this becomes a reality or a serious issue, becomes thinking, what are we going to lose? And what are we going to lose? It's important. So we take it very seriously. We're listening very carefully. Everyone, I think, is making a very serious effort to keep the union, fully as a union, whether it's Greece or whether it's the UK. I think what is important is to see why we are doing this. politically. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Nam and Professor Lee, for your comments and questions. I'd like to address the main point, which is about the nature of Asian integration, which is multi-track. I think this is in parallel fashion with the World Trade Organization, which is divided into more than 400 regional trading agreements, or RTAs. So within Asia, this is replicated through these different interregional or sub-regional institutions. And I think the bottom line here is, if we can break down the barriers within these smaller sub-regional or interregional groupings, then we can promote open regionalism once the barriers between and among those countries involved in those forums or groupings are broken down. So this is the context by which the RTAs within the WTO is allowed, right? Which in the long run, just like in our Asian context, we have the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership and the TPP. In the long run, then this will amount to the achievement of the Asia-Pacific Free Trade Area, or APEC. Now, in terms of the role of political factors, which was also mentioned by Professor Lee, in terms of the need to institutionalize, and which was highlighted by our keynote speaker, Professor Kim. The case of ASEAN, there was a lack of political leadership, in fact, when it was established in 1967 until 1992, and that explained why ASEAN has proceeded very slowly. But when Singapore hosted the 1992 summit, this declaration was signed to institutionalize the ASEAN Summit, which is to be held once every 3 years, whereas before, as and when, the ad hoc type of arrangements. So that is one improvement in the case of ASEAN. There's also the institutionalization through the ASEAN Charter, whereas before we were a loose organization. We are now bound by the rules of the Constitution, which is the ASEAN Charter. And I also agree with Professor Park in terms of the leadership issue, specifically in terms of how do you achieve this trilateral FTA. And if I just recalled the case of NAFTA, I think many people would think that NAFTA was formed initially between Canada and the United States, which it was not. It was in fact formed between the United States and Mexico, and then Canada joined, having weighed all the pros and cons. So this is the 2+N framework. Similar-minded countries can initially join the partnership. So, for example, Singapore and Korea, or Korea and China, Korea and Japan, and so on and so forth. So as long as that 2+N formula, right, other countries can join the two countries if they are ready, right? So we consider the levels of development in the Asian context in terms of letting them grow and develop first, and this is where the European Union continues to come in through their assistance, through their trade and investment, so that our economies here in Asia will grow and develop, and therefore we will be able to give up our tariffs, right, which is the major source of revenues for the poorer developing countries. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Director Nam's question about whether trilateral FTA is still desirable to pursue. I do think so. I mean, I fully admit and I fully agree with you that FTA is dealing with the economics, but it's involving a lot of politics and diplomacy as well, right? If you take a look at the US FTA policy or EU's FTA policy, it's more diplomacy than politics. The very fact that the US started its first FTA with Israel, and the European preferential trading arrangements with ACP countries, Euromed countries, Mediterranean countries, all indicate that this is really a political and diplomacy instrument. So it is really true that we have to carefully pay attention to the politics and diplomacy when pursuing the FTA. But FTA can be an excellent instrument to lessen these political tensions. Because in FTA, we could have a mutually beneficial outcome. And this mutually beneficial outcome could lead to the detente of the countries. And I think this is one argument that is brought about by proponents of FTA in the relationship to multilateralism. And I do think that this is also needed in the Northeast Asian context. I mean, we have to do other things as well, but we can do FTA, and this FTA can be contributing to the easing of the tension. I mean, you are right. Is it possible, right? In the context of, or in the light of ever-frequenting conflicts with territorial disputes, with the history textbook disputes, and so on and so forth. But if we do not do any efforts to cooperate with each other, then the situation could aggravate. And we have to do something, and something could be found in the economic integration. That is my answer to your question. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your responses. It's just the time end of first session, but the floor will open. I invite two questioners in the audience. If you have the question, okay. Dr. Kim, please.
On behalf of my students who are with us, I'd like to thank you for the enlightening and educating us. I have one question related with the leadership issue. Looking back the experience of European integration, it seems like the leadership exercised by the France and Germany, it was more than a historical accident. France was, I think that their exercising leadership could be successful because France was ready to assume the role of political leader for this process of integration by extending the hands of reconciliation concerning all those atrocities done for many decades or even centuries by mostly Germany. And Germany was ready to assume the economic or financial leadership which are needed to, let's say, make others come along with this process of integration. So my question to Professor Park would be, which country do you think in this region would be ready to assume the political leadership, specifically the extending the hands of reconciliation, and which country seems to be ready to assume the financial responsibility which are needed for the grand East Asian economic community or what?
Thank you, Dr. Kim. Professor Park, please. Your responses to
I'll answer. Yes, thank you very much for this very challenging question, Dr. Kim. I'd like to answer this, to this question referring to ASEAN. I mean, when I take a look at ASEAN structure and ASEAN cooperation, there are two leadership countries. One is Indonesia, and Indonesia is playing the role of France in Europe. It's a political leader with a very big population, with some, that is giving Indonesia the role of a political leader. But there is not necessarily economic or financial leadership here in ASEAN, but intellectual leadership. And in my view, intellectual leadership is played by Singapore. In Singapore, you have a lot of international organizations, a lot of think tanks doing the job for devising and advising the authorities and devising visions and making instruments for achieving the goal and vision of ASEAN integration. I think that is probably can be applied to Northeast Asia. And therefore, we have, as I noted, there is a leadership vacuum. I mean, because of the rivalry, because of on and off frequenting the tensions and political problems, we have no leadership here playing the role. So that probably we can make Korea to play the leadership role in intellectual aspect. So intermediate role and devising, persuading the two giants in the Northeast Asian region or in East Asian whole region, how to reconcile, how to make the merging and docking of the very many FTAs and regional, sub-regional settings together, and that's my answer to you.
Thank you, Dr. Kim, Professor Park. We invite the second questioner, please, with your name and affiliation.
Okay, well, I've more comment which is from Europe to Asia than a question. It was thought with the adoption of the euro that there will be economic convergence within Europe. Well, there was no economic convergence, but most commentators insist on the divergence on the fiscal results. But in fact, there's another divergence which happened, which is not always noticed. There's been a real divergence in the economic structure of European countries. Namely, if you look at industrial production, it increased by 30% in the north, decreased by 10% in the south during the last 10 years. And this has a big effect on the current account of north, which increased, and south, which decreased. And this is a background of the crisis. And whatever happened on the fiscal policy, this inequalities, this divergence on the real economies will still be a problem. And it shows that for other countries, that if you have a current, if you have the same currency with countries which are very unequal, this inequality is going to increase.
Thank you very much, Chaponier. There's no necessary to responses for his comments. So I have no time to summarize this first session, but we stop here for first session. Thank you very much for 3 speakers and 2 discussants. Let's give them big hand. Thank you.